All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of the New England Women's Policy Conference. I'm Carrie Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Commission on Women, and I am so happy to be here with all of you and to be here at this conference. I've been part of this conference since the very beginning, and every year it's great, and every time it's a bit different. And this year, we didn't really know how it was going to be being online, and it's been fantastic. I feel like we can all really, it feels very intimate somehow, all looking at each other through Zoom. And I'm just really glad that you're all here, and we've had such an amazing couple of days. I keep having images of tables, right? This metaphor of the table comes up over and over again. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. If there's no chair for you at the table, bring your own. And when we sit at the table, we shake the table, and let's all be table shakers. The words of Ayanna Pressley are just ringing in my ears, as well as all those of all the other women that have brought us to where we are today. So on our third day today, we have some really great stuff in plan for you. I'll just kind of go over a little bit of what we're going to do today. We're going to start with hearing report outs from representatives from the breakout sessions that we've had over the past couple of days, so you can hear some of what happened in the sessions that you weren't part of. And then we'll hear from 2 speakers who are going to talk about some of the particular challenges for women of color and young women. And then after that, we're going to put you all into state-based breakout groups. So you'll get together with people from your state and your region, and you'll have a chance to have some really in-depth discussions with others, with your neighbors, about solutions and actions that are going to help move us toward equity for everybody in New England. And then when you come back, we'll have closing remarks to wrap up the conference. So with that, I will pass things over for your welcome now to Dr. Lori Ansaya Jefferson. She'll get us started with opening remarks and the report outs. Dr. Ansaya Jefferson is the director of the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, and an expert on the intersection of race, class, and gender in healthcare, and social policy. Take it away, Lori.
Thanks so much, Carrie. It was a wonderful, wonderful introduction. Good morning. It's wonderful to welcome back many of you and say hello for the first time to others. I'm very much looking forward to the last day of this conference, where we will consolidate our assessment of the challenges and opportunities for women and girls, especially women and girls of color and LGBTQs. As noted, the challenges we are addressing are many. Women in the United States are more likely than men to live in poverty. They are far more likely to experience sexual abuse and assault, and cannot always access reproductive and adequate culturally relevant healthcare services. Moreover, girls and women of color must also deal with racism in its overt and covert forms. The psychological toll of this lived experience is consequential, yet all too often overlooked or misunderstood. Girls and women of color who internalize their problems pass under the radar, while others who act out are stigmatized, and in the case of girls and women of color in particular, may be criminalized. It is also time to reiterate, and we talked about this in the conference over the last couple of days, what has been called the gender of COVID and how it interacts with the color of COVID. The pandemic has had a significant impact on women, especially the participation of Black and Latinx and some groups of Asian women in the labor market. This convergence of race and gender disparities challenges our assumptions about the structure of work and reveals the paradoxes of emerging stay-at-home economy, an economy in which women and people of color make up the majority of both essential workers and the unemployed. I am sure some of this was highlighted again in the low wage and essential worker panel yesterday. At the same time, while the 2008 recession was referred to as the man session, the current one is more likely and should be called the she session. And again, a majority of American jobs lost in April in leisure, hospitality, education, in some parts of the healthcare industry were held by women, with Black and Latinx women disproportionately affected. Consider the childcare sector virtually essential to gender equity in the workplace, which is mainly staffed by women, particularly women of color, but has been shattered by this pandemic. Women also seem to be shattering the burden of homeschooling. The disproportionate time women temporarily invest in childcare is a primary reason for the gender pay gap and mummy track phenomena. As Claire Kane Miller, who reports on gender and the future of work, noted recently, now that women are spending more time on childcare chores in this pandemic, the repercussions are very, very bad. And what we also know is that for single moms who are disproportionately Black and brown, balancing work and parenting responsibilities at home is even more challenging. Single parents often depend on extended networks, including grandparents, but are cut off from their circles of support during the pandemic. So again, I just wanted to give you some brief highlights about how racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination are encountered by women and the need to develop strategies and policies to address them. This is exactly what we'll be doing today. But I just want to also say something on a more positive note. Although there are many challenges that women encounter, we are also resilient and have many opportunities as well. We have just elected the first African-American and South Asian woman as the vice president. In addition, women will gain at least 14 seats in the 117th Congress, setting a new record for female representation. In 2018, the nation elected 127 women and 48 women of color to the House and the Senate. I am very, very excited about today. We're individuals and organizational representatives who are passionate about the development and well-being of their communities, in particular about girls and women of color, will have their voices heard. They will highlight strategies to address them in our state-based breakout groups. We so often hear from the experts, but what was noted by Kirsten Darcy on Wednesday in the healthcare workshop was that the voices of people tell authentic and very meaningful stories that force us to hear the truth. We were hearing the truth a lot over the last few days. We need to not only listen to, but value and act on these stories. We must ask ourselves, why is some knowledge valued more than others? What can we do more of to hear these truths? So what is also going to be very positive, as Carrie mentioned, we are going to hone in today on the specifics of the state. We're going to be addressing challenges and opportunities. We're going to determine what are some of the priority issues that we must focus on in specific states and across the region. And we will get a sense of what the organizations are doing to address these challenges and opportunities. And so one of the things that will happen in this breakout is that individuals will be urged to consider potential collaborative efforts, building alliances and anti-racist and gender justice approaches that can be addressed. And we will also think not only about the distal causes, but also the proximate causes. As noted on the first day, the knowledge from CWPP research, other scholarship in the field, information from our convenings, including today, will be used to inform the development of a NUPI 2020 call to action. We will utilize this guide to encourage policy action, including advocacy and legislative bodies, and also on our priorities and areas of focus. And many of you can be involved in our NUPI network. We will ask you in the next few days if you have an interest in joining the NUPI network, or if you have the time and inclination also to join our NUPI steering committee. We are particularly looking for partners representing more women of color, youth, and LGBT partnerships, but all are welcome. There's a lot of work that we need to do in New England. So today, we will continue to listen, learn, and we will roll up our sleeves to get the work done. Thank you very much in reference to where we're going for today. But the first thing on our agenda, and I'm really very excited about this, is to hear from representatives from the following groups: health and healthcare, childcare and education, policing, low-wage and essential workers, and also representatives from the Ignite track. I will call on each of the different representatives from these different panel groups. So first I will call—
Sorry to jump in real quick. I just want to remind our speakers that we do have ASL interpretation today. And if you can be mindful of how quickly you're speaking so the interpreters can keep up with you and provide that interpretation, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise, for that reminder. So I'm going to call on first Jill Ashton, and she will provide a summary of childcare and the childcare and education panel. Take it away, Jill.
Excellent. Good morning, Denise. Thank you so much for that reminder, because I have a tendency to speak quickly. And thank you so much to Lori for those fantastic welcoming remarks, but to help us frame our work. I think I personally found them very helpful, and I'm grateful for them. And then thank you each and every one of you for being here today on day 3. You know, what my colleague Carrie said is true, like we've made it to day 3 and now the hard work begins. And so thank you for engaging in that. I'm going to try to speak briefly and slowly because that's what I need to do in order to keep us on track, in order to make sure that everyone hears me. So the panel for childcare, which occurred on day 1, was fantastic. I want to say thank you to all of the speakers. They were wonderful. If you're able to join that conversation, I hope you agree. The chat was very rich. I want to thank everyone who participated in the discussion on that first day, and would encourage anyone who didn't participate to check out the links that the center will share to the chat and to the information that's shared within the chat. Big takeaways. So the challenges that we're seeing, everyone agrees, or it seems like everyone was, in our conversation on first day agrees, pre-existed the crisis with COVID. We have a system that has been underfunded and under-resourced, underappreciated for decades. And I want to thank Megan Madison. She put a particularly fine point on this. This is because of who is doing the work, right? We have women and women of color who are so frequently caring, providing care for others. And that work has been undervalued and in many cases invisible. And because of that, again, the crisis that we're finding ourselves in means that this issue has been exacerbated. But there's also opportunity there as well, right? So we have folks that had the privilege of ignoring or not feeling the pain of that issue, all of a sudden need to see it now, or need to manage it now. With men who have traditionally not played as a significant role in household caregiving, we're all home together, or many of us are home together. And so now men are being engaged in that question. So we can build something from this moment that is going to allow us not only to meet the needs of this moment, but really be part of this larger movement around a justice or a just care system in our country. The other key point in our discussion was that care and care providing, education, that is something that is a social good. We've committed to that in many ways, right? Like we have a real clear understanding that a K-12 education is essential good and necessary for a functioning society. We haven't yet extended that to birth through K. And there really is a strong case to be made for that. And in many, many ways, right? We need to be able to be committed to educational equity. We need to be able to ensure the health and wellness of our economy. We need to have gender equality in terms of women's access to work outside of the home. So all of those things require us to act. We had a very interesting and rich conversation about what that might look like, how businesses might engage, how government might engage, ways that we can be innovative about the work. This crisis that we're in is devastating for women, as Lori pointed out earlier. And again, my hope, and I think the hope of those who participated in the conversation yesterday, is that we're able to work together. I particularly appreciated when Congresswoman Presley said to us, we can build a just economy or a just society if we do it together. And it's going to require all folks to be heard and to participate in what our future might look like. I will end there. I am of course pleased to take questions in the chat. And if there was, I think, any other folks that were participating as speakers, if I missed anything essential, I invite you to share that in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Jill. And now we'll move on to Maria Gonzalez-Avishek, who will provide us a summary of the health and healthcare panel.
Thank you, Lori. Nice to hear from Jill. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. I know many participated on our health and healthcare panel, we were discussing really the impact on different communities of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think many of the issues that were brought up really were the issues that Dr. Lori and Saya Jefferson actually pointed out today. So all these inequalities that were exacerbated, and about like immigrant communities, people of color, and women of color particularly being the hardest hit. And we were all commenting how that did not surprise public health experts. I also have to add that part of the conversation really went around the fact that there's an intersection in the different issues that affect women and how that actually impacts health. So we did take about, we mentioned childcare, we mentioned workforce issues in transportation and access to housing and nutrition, immigration, health outcomes, all these social determinants of health that are part of health. So it's very hard to separate the different topics because they're all interconnected. And we were talking about some of the issues that we were seeing in terms of immigrant communities being impacted, specifically Asian community and Latin American communities, but we also talked about maternal health, and we talked about like the different initiatives that are happening in the different states. We talked a lot about the need for cultural and linguistic appropriate care. We talked about the trauma that resulted from all the racism that was attached to the crisis. And we also talked about the isolation, mental health, the stress that many of our communities are facing, particularly those families that have special needs. And then we were talking about barriers to access and testing and treatment and so forth. But I do want to talk about today about the key solutions that we were looking at and the hope and the light and how we move forward from here. There were many things that were being done to address some of these barriers. We were talking about how important it was to do cultural and linguistic competent care campaigns and invest in educational campaigns. We were talking about the power of narratives, how important it is to collect quantitative data about diversity, about who are the people that are impacted, but also the qualitative data, like who are the people that are impacted, what is their story, what is their experience. We were very appreciative of the flexibility that some funders offered. I think that that was key to address the pandemic. There were policies that were implemented in the short term that were helpful to weather the storm, but maybe didn't go far enough. For example, the moratorium on evictions, the fact that there were no extra expenses for COVID-19 related services, or how fast telehealth was implemented when we were fighting for that for years. But then we also highlighted that there's a need for long-term and deep reforms if we really want to fix the issues that were highlighted. One of them, the biggest issue, is the structural racism, and that includes, but that is not limited to, for example, dismantling tokenism and stop using people of color and women of color as like the flag so that you actually feel that you're doing something for those communities. And that's the table, again, that we were talking about. It's not just bringing them to the table, it's not just listening to them, it's actually having them make the decisions. When declaring racism as a public health emergency rather than a crisis could be a very key point, because in fact it is. The need, for example, for other kinds of reforms such as immigration reform, but also equitable access to housing, for rental, but also for ownership, access to nutritional foods, access to mental and behavioral health services, and then wide access to telehealth services, addressing as well the digital divide, and also making sure that the delivery system is culturally, linguistically competent and can actually serve everyone equitable. So I think I'm gonna stop here, but I'm also available for any questions. And I have to say that that panel was very intense, very productive, and it was a pleasure to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was a wonderful summary. And now we'll move on to Sasha Goodfriend, policing, and she will provide a summary of the policing of communities of color and LGBT.
Good morning, everyone. It is so great to be here virtually with you. Sasha Goodfriend, she, her pronouns, from Mass Now here. This is my third conference, also 6 years. And I just want to give a shout out to all the young feminists here virtually with us to come back next time, run for office, get involved. I'm so glad to see you here. So I also was honored to be on the steering committee for this conference with all of these incredible women here. And I think it's notable as we talk about this panel to say that this is the first time this conference has had a panel on policing of women of color and LGBTQ communities. And so I say that to say this is a large conversation that we're going to need, that we were not able to finish completely yesterday. And I want to invite all of us to dig into this issue more if it hasn't been on your priority list already. We had an incredible lineup of speakers moderated by Dr. Callie Liu, a research scholar from Brandeis. We also had State Representative Liz Miranda, who talked about being one of 3 women of color in the Massachusetts State House and how important it is to be recruiting, training, and electing more women of color, Black women, to the State House in order to bring more majority voices to this issue when we are passing policy. And we had Angelina Resto from Black and Pink, who is the first trans woman, I believe, to have been able to change the facility that she was housed in as an incarcerated inmate to align with her gender identity. This is notable because while that was technically enacted in law many years ago, in 2013 through the governor's executive order, it took years for that law to actually be implemented into the lived experiences of people like Angelina. And we had Joyce Wise from Rhode Island from Black Lives Matter's PAC. And the first question for our panel was to talk about what does police violence look like in your community? And it was really awful to hear the stories from Joyce. She told a story that she was just talking to a friend who had been sedated while arrested at night and was sedated so much that she was then hospitalized for 2 days and then didn't have clothes when she woke up and had to go home on the bus in a nightgown from the hospital, not sure what had happened to her body for the last 2 days, and no accountability or repercussions to the police who did this to her. And this is not a unique story. State Representative Liz Miranda said that growing up, her dad and her brother were both incarcerated, and at points in her life, it felt like everyone she knew in her community was incarcerated. And I want everyone to take a moment to think about what that would be like if your dad or your brother or everyone in your community was also incarcerated. Because this is an issue that is disproportionately impacting girls of color and the LGBTQ community. It's not impacting all women and girls equally. We also know this because the State House, the Massachusetts State House yesterday also came out with a report with new data for the first time on the juvenile justice system. And this data shows, not surprisingly, that when you hold constant for arrangements and everything, there are still huge disparities in terms of the incarceration rate and recidivism rate for girls of color. And we know from national research on LGBTQ youth that that is true as well. Though I don't know if we have the SOGI data in Massachusetts to do that analysis in terms of the justice system as well. Also, so we started talking about lived experiences with police violence. And when we move to talking about systemic change, I think it's really notable to talk about. Liz Miranda was very happy to, this week, the police reform, or the police accountability bill was passed and is now in the governor's office. And so an action alert for anyone in Massachusetts is to call the governor's office and ask for the Racial Justice Police Accountability Bill to be passed. And yeah, I think to end on the policy note, I want to say that we're talking about an intersectional full cycle, right? So we don't want to just start at prison reform, and we don't want to end at prison reform, because prison was not the goal and should not be the solution in the first place. So going back through the lifeline, we want to look at diversion opportunities that we can enact through policy. We want to look at school resource officers in schools who are often retired police officers and are not social workers and are responsible for the school to prison pipeline, a large part. And it's a whole system that we need to reform, keeping abolition in mind as our real goal, not just police reform. So I'm sure I did not cover everything. Please add in the chat, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all in our state cohorts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. That was a wonderful summary, and we are so pleased that you were part of our NUPI committee in terms of planning this conference as well as others. So we'll move into the low wage and essential workers summary given by Kaya Morris, who was the moderator of the panel, and the Movement Politics Director of Rights and Democracy. Take it away, Kaya.
Good morning, thank you. So the breakout that we had for low wage and essential workers, thinking about women and holding women in this conversation, we had on our panel, we had Rachel Flem, we had Georgia Hollister Isman, and we had Eva Milona. So really, in thinking and framing the conversation, some of these things are not terribly new to anyone, I think, on this call, considering that life for women, especially under COVID, has multiple challenges and has really kind of revealed the fragility of our safety nets. And we're seeing that many of our, the industries that women, especially that are from the lower paying sectors are within, have really just taken a hit as far as being able to stay open, their viability and their strength. We've realized that childcare is an enormous part of this equation, as well as many parents are now having to also deal with remote learning or homeschooling, and as well as kin care in various ways. We also recognized fully that undocumented women are not often eligible, even for many of the services, and often face exploitation when there are less eyes on what's happening within the workforce. We also lifted up the experiences of those from the disability community as well, as in a completely often, well, a very often invisible sector of our workforce that has been on the receiving end of the worst of our abilities to care for each other within our state systems, and the challenges that they faced, and now the additional compoundment of COVID, of making it unsafe for many to actually be part of our workforce. So in thinking about what this means specifically for migrant or refugee women, that just recognizing that nationally there are 11.9 million immigrant workers within the United States, and almost a quarter of those are essential workers. Immigrant women are the backbone of our economy and communities, and when we leave them out of the workforce, both the economy and the communities that they live in and reside in suffer greatly. But there's definitely policy implications that we want to consider specific to the needs of those from immigrant or refugee populations that are universal, but need some additional eyes to ensure that they will actually be portable, and they will be transferable to those who might be undocumented or are in an uncertain immigration status. So we're looking at individuals, what does this mean around our domestic violence work? What does this mean around family and medical leave? What does this mean around the stimulus checks? All of these different pieces that are coming through are going to be really important to keep an eye on, to try to make sure that those communities are kept whole. We also looked at the concept that people, when we're thinking about childcare, when we're thinking about living wage, when we're thinking about universal safety nets, these are popular ideas. These are solutions that people want. They actually, overwhelmingly, we see this happen in survey after survey, that these are the values that we hold, and these are the expectations that we have from both our federal, state, and local governments to be able to help provide for us to actually have a fair and a just society. Now that people are feeling these effects, they're seeing them tangibly in their lives, the ways that they made a difference. We need to continue to mobilize around that and keep the conversation going so that we don't have a sudden departure or forget the lessons that we learned from the many safety nets that have come through and the exponential rate that we were able to implement them. And look at that, that was actually able to happen in real time and not take 10 years. So we also recognize that in this moment, many BIPOC women, women from the global majority, are supporting multiple generations within their households. So it goes far beyond just the nuclear family, but many are caring for many others within this time period. And the youngest and the oldest are actually being impacted the most when we consider this. So what we need to think about is a multi-year, multi-sector campaign to talk about women's roles in our economy. And women, especially immigrant and refugee women, are often also not concluded in that conversation. But women, we know, are the backbone of our economy. We need to take seriously the conversation and dive deeper into tax fairness, progressive taxes, taxing the wealthy to support those essential workers. We also wanted to recognize the struggles of women when we're looking at the gaps. We also can lift up what are some areas of hope. What is this moment teaching us right now about ways that we were able to see successes, gains, or hopeful trends that we should continue to support. So thinking about holistically about paid and unpaid giving roles within our economy. These, this is common. This is the invisible labor that takes place that is requirement for our country to continue functioning in the ways that it does. And so now we have to think more, much more with much greater depth around that work. We recognize that the stimulus funds that did come through was incredibly helpful for many families. It was not sufficient. We're not going to claim that, but it was incredibly helpful. And we saw that it helped people better take care of their families. So how do we use that to then continue to increase working and living wages for all, right? I'm a believer in universal basic income. I'm just going to keep saying that. So new consciousness of caregiving as well. Recognizing that men had to stay home with children running around in the background, and they can now better see that struggle of that duality of the roles that we play. So it has created, in many cases, a greater empathy. That's very important. Also recognizing that the business community is now talking differently, thinking about what this means for childcare and leave policies, thinking differently about what this might mean for telecommuting, as well as thinking about what it might mean for those that can have flexible schedules. There still is a piece to this that I didn't want to forget to mention as we talk about all of that as well, is that holding true, though, that simply using flex time still creates work on top of work. So while it is a tool that helps make it possible for women who may be hourly or have their hours monetized, are going to still need to create that income. They can't have those income losses, but that we're then still asking for often women to do 2 to 3 times the amount of work in a given day than they might, or to do extended hours. I also didn't bring this in the group, but I want to say this here. One of the things I've heard when we talked about these workplace changes amongst women and caregivers in these time during COVID is people are saying that their families are missing them, and that it's very hard for them to be in the same home, but then not see their family members because they're working 13, 14 hours in a day. So thinking again around disparities, the ways that we're speaking about, we talk about this in a very aspirational way. Okay, we have these gaps and we need to fill the gaps. But then there are places that don't easily fit in between the gaps and that are mitigating those gaps. Well, actually, I shouldn't say mitigating, they're exacerbating the gaps. So thinking about what this means for women of color, for BIPOC women in a racially charged and increasingly violent time. So in this very moment, as we're hearing comments coming from the Oval Office, as always, as we're seeing the rises of militias within our communities, as xenophobia has never ever abated and has only increased in current times, what are the ways that women in the workforce, these women that they cannot hide behind their identities. Our identities are who we are, and they are what you see. We are visibly carrying our identities with us at different points in time. How are we able to help support these women in these times? And what are the real challenges that we need to hold true as to whether or not people are able to fully participate or not participate? I think of healthcare workers, too many that I know that are women of color that are constantly dealing with racism. And especially during this time of COVID, where many of the people that they're trying to treat don't believe in COVID and are just seeing these very important essential workers as and treating them with hostility. So there's a physical toll that this takes on women of color, and that was significant before this moment, but it's even more so now. And it's actually a dynamic that's unhealthy and it's dangerous. At this point in time, we're recognizing that women of color are at a disadvantage and that there's uncertainties, but that immigration status adds an additional component. That intersectionality of identity and experience continues to just amplify the challenges that women are facing. We need to be thoughtful in making sure that there are diverse people and ideas and communities. My cat's back here for those of you who are in the session, so she might come join us again. So immigration status is another barrier for women and foreign-born women within this work. We also need to be thoughtful in making sure that there's, oh, I'm sorry, she distracts me like that. So that we are at those decision-making tables and that we're able to think about that balance of the stress of having to carry that work, having to carry those multiple forms and compounding forms of oppression into those workplaces and those decision-making spaces where we're trying to make the changes, and recognizing that this is extractive and extra work for women in those spaces, but we need it. We need that work to get done. So as we went to our participant Q&A, there were some really important reminders, considering who's making your food, that there are many, many women that are within the agriculture and in the food systems, within our food systems that are also, again, wholly invisible. So always remembering that many are immigrants and are undocumented. That we talk a lot about minimum wage and that number going up. It's still not sufficient. It is not in any way, shape, or form a livable wage, even for what our aspirational goals are around that, but that there's many holes within the minimum wage laws as far as who can qualify for at those optimal levels, and that we still have entire sectors that are not captured under there because they're still receiving reduced pay, and actually shifting the language from minimum wage to livable wage. And then I want to go a step further to dignified wages. We also need to look at worker retraining programs and just transition for sectors that are closing. We also need to look at better investment in adult education, parent-child centers as a model, and funding structures that might help support those, and bringing awareness to the needs of seniors as well. Women that are classified as seniors that are still within our workforce, that are seeking to be within our workforce or are unable to participate within the workforce because of COVID right now. And so recognizing that when we talk about low-wage workers and when we talk about women in the workforce, we often still work within this time frame that's very much stamped to a fertility model and a productivity model that recognizes more 18 to middle age, and that doesn't capture all of the women that are within our workforce. So I think that's all I have. Oh, and artists, and a shout out for artists in the creative arts that they need to be valued and advocated, especially in these times when we need this art as a healing modality. So I think that's everything.
Thank you so much, Kia. We will now move on to Alicia Smith, who will provide us with a summary from the Ignite sessions.
Good morning, and thank you, Lori, for that introduction. My name is Alicia Smith, and I am the New York Fellow with Ignite National. This has been an amazing past 3 days, and I'm very happy to share our reports back from our breakout session, as well as from our workshops and panelists. I'd like to start by giving a thank you to our panelists. The first one, Paths to Political Power, Hope Williams, Juana Matas, and Jessica Weaver. Thank you for giving your insight on how to run for office, your path to becoming an elected official, as well as the work you do behind the scenes on campaigns. And then our advocacy workshop, which had Andrea Gonzalez, Isabel Garcia, and Noel Williams. We definitely appreciated your insights from mental health, as well as the work that we can do on the ground level. And then lastly, the Ignite team that put this all together, especially Ana del Castillo. Thank you for your breathing workshops and reminding us to really center ourselves as we talk about these serious issues, and to remember the positive work that we are doing, as well as we do the hard work. And then Sarah and Amy for your efforts as well. So during our breakout session, we conducted a poll and we asked everyone to share their policy priorities and recommendations. This discussion brought up various issues from jobs and unemployment to immigration and everything far and in between. However, we found there were 3 issues that came up repeatedly. And I'd like to take a second to show you the slide we created that depicts those issues. So I'm going to share. Oh, do I have access to screen share? Okay, cool, I did. Let's see, view and present. So the top 3 were racial inequality, gender inequality, and health and safety. So I'm gonna talk a bit briefly about each 3 and the solutions and recommendations that were provided by our attendees for these issues. So the first one was racial inequality. We found that some suggestions towards how we can improve policy around racial inequality included creating safe spaces and centers for BIPOC, Black, Brown, Latinx, queer, and transgender youth. We also thought it would be a great idea to invest more in BIPOC candidates, LGBTQ candidates, and really empower them to step into their political power. We also decided that we needed to change where the current priorities lay and direct the money to where it's needed, which includes taking it away from systems that are hurting these groups of people and putting them into resources that would help these groups, including education, ways to run for office, learning more about local government, and just investing in minority communities in general. There also needed to be a focus on centering the experiences of BIPOC people and redistributions of wealth. And then I noticed as we talked about racial inequality and coming off of this election, there was a discussion around voter suppression and the needs to put more money and more focus into stopping voter suppression in these different groups. The next one I want to talk about is gender inequality. So gender inequality, some suggestions we had was providing resources, increasing awareness on gender inequality, starting to have these hard conversations either with your friends or family, and then educating each other about the gaps in gender inequality, just making it known. We all have social media, we all have our own things that we're doing. So it's not that hard to start this conversation. And just by starting the conversation could be the first step in changing policy and changing legislation towards gender equality. And then we also included universal childcare and gender inequality. It was brought up in one of our panel discussions that if you are focused on how are you going to provide for your children, how are you going to take care of your family, then you won't have the energy or the opportunities to run for office or change your community at a local level. So there needs to be a lot of support for women when it comes to childcare and just caring for families and others in general. And I think a previous speaker mentioned that too, that there needs to be a lot of focus on how we provide for our basic needs first before we can provide for other people. And then the last one was health and safety. When it came to health and safety, Disability access was huge. It is an issue that's not often spoke about, so we wanted to always remember that remember to include people who have disabilities and include resources for them in our conversations, as well as updating the victim protection laws. One thing that came up during our discussion was gender-based violence and human trafficking. So if we could update policies surrounding that, for example, the Victims Protection Act, and update it to 2020 and to include BIPOC and LGBTQ, that's a great step in a direction of making sure our policies and resources and services fit folks that which it needs to and which it may have historically been left out. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And as I wrap this up, if anyone wants to share in the chat box their takeaways from the Ignite session, I would love that. Or just any other highlights you have, please share in the chat box. But ultimately, as we walked away from our discussions for the last 2 days, we mainly took away ideas on how we can shift our level of consciousness and how to look at our policies through an anti-racist lens and always be mindful of the experiences of queer and trans youth, and really empower each other to step into our political power, as well as be aware of the local offices and the local ways we can make change in our communities. And so on that note, that was everything from the Ignite session. And again, please share in the chat box if you had any other takeaways, and I'll be in the chat box too. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. You had an amazing, amazing set of recommendations and observations. I wish I could have been at every single one of the panels. I was just sort of like shaking my head because I had no way to do that. But again, you really have made a difference in terms of what we need to think about in terms of our NUPE and our broader initiatives in the state and in New England. So again, thank the panelists so much.
All right, thank you all so much. That was fantastic. It was great to get to hear some of what happened in the sessions that I wasn't a part of. Really appreciate it. We are next going to move into a panel of speakers, a duo of speakers. But before we do that, in preparation for our state-based group breakouts, I would like to ask all of you to rename yourselves with your state at the beginning of your name. And you can see that I added a VT in front of my name. And for anyone who doesn't know how to do this, quick tutorial, if you hover over your picture, 3 little dots will appear in the upper right-hand corner of your picture. And if you click on that, you'll get a drop-down menu where you'll see an option for rename. And then it just lets you name yourself whatever you want. So if you could add your state abbreviation at the beginning of your name, that will help us get everyone into the right breakouts when we're ready to go. So, but first, we are going to hear from a team of speakers who are going to be giving us some remarks on challenges, opportunities, and strategies for a call to action. Our speakers will highlight key challenges that women, and particularly women of color and young women in New England, are facing. And hopefully that will spark our thinking before we head into our state-based breakout rooms for further discussion. So I'd like to introduce the 2 speakers that we have coming up next. We will hear from Dr. Lorna Rivera, who is the director of the Mauricio Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy. And she's also associate professor of women's, gender, sexuality studies, and Latino studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her research and publications focus on women's and family literacy programs, gender, racial, and ethnic-based health disparities, and the education of Latinx and bilingual students. She serves on the board of directors for the Hyde Square Task Force, which is an arts-based Afro-Latinx youth agency in Boston's Jamaica Plain neighborhood. She's an appointed member of the City of Boston's COVID Health Inequities Task Force, and she's a board member of the school committee of the Boston Public Schools. We will also hear from Sarah Guillermo, the executive director of Ignite. As a founding member of the Ignite team, Sarah was instrumental in growing the organization from a small high school-based program in the California Bay Area to the largest, most diverse young women's political leadership program in the country. Via the program model that Sarah co-developed with Ignite's founder, in 2020, Ignite is on track to train upwards of 10,000 young women across 30 states to own their political power. As a breast cancer survivor, Sarah is deeply committed to reforming local healthcare policies and systems to better meet the needs of diverse communities. She currently serves on the Concord Pleasant Hill Healthcare Community Board, where she serves as a voice to advance community healthcare priorities. Thank you so much, Lorna and Sarah. Take it away.
All right, good morning, everybody. The sun has not risen yet here in California, but maybe we'll get some sunrise during our time together. Lorna and I have been meeting the past couple days and are so excited about this conversation we're about to have. And so we're gonna have 3 beats to our 30 minutes together. So just to preview that for folks, we're gonna start off with just sharing a little bit more about how Lorna and I show up to this work and our different paths to get here, to share a little bit more around our bios. And I'm gonna try really hard to not talk as fast as I normally do. So I'll breathe between sentences. And then 2, we're gonna take a little bit of time reflecting on some of the different pieces. And then ultimately, the framework in which we wanna leave with you all today are just some tools to really think about how do we address these very, very deep pieces that are happening in our country right now. I know that we're all thinking about COVID as the global pandemic, but I think we can all agree that there are multiple pandemics that have been happening before COVID that have been impacting women and BIPOC women and young women and all of us around this country around racial inequality, and gender inequality for decades and centuries. And so there's a lot for us to digest. And so we want you all to walk away with some very specific tools as you go into these state breakouts, but also as you walk into whatever your role is, whether it's a student role, an ED role, a state ledge role after you leave the conference today. And so Lorna, I'll have you start and kind of share a little bit more about your paths to the work. I know that you have lots of responsibilities, and so talk a little bit more about that.
So thank you again, Sarah. And I just also want to acknowledge my great friends, our sister institute, the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. It's great to see Anne back here on the call. I've been at UMass Boston for 20 years and have long admired the work of the CWPP back to the days of Carol Hardy Fanta. And so just I really love working with Lori and her team, Muna, Denise. It's just what a wonderful, Krista. So just appreciate them very much. I wanted to just mention about the Gaston Institute, which I am honored to be the 5th director in its 30-year history. Like the CWPP, the Gaston Institute was founded by the state legislature in Massachusetts. Over 30 years ago, we were seeing demographic changes in our state where the Latinx population had really changed in terms of more Central and South Americans, coming to our region. A lot of that, again, related to US military interventions in the 1980s. And we saw many Salvadorians and Hondurans and Colombians too coming to our area. So our institute really does research to disaggregate the data, to look at the specific challenges that are facing the very diverse, Latinx communities that we serve and are growing, right, nationally, not just locally. So, out of that experience, again, I've been very also active in some of the local Boston, politics and, really interested again in building solidarity across these issues. And certainly many of the themes that have come up, again, the Gaston, I ask you to visit our website and see some of the research studies that we've done. And we did one on COVID, done one on Latino wages. And so issues that have come up here, around these disparities and how our immigrant women, right, are those essential workers, and the COVID impact that has been so, traumatic for our communities. So I hope to share with you a little bit in a minute or so then, and thank you, Sarah, for letting me speak a little bit here. I want to share some of the kind of decision-making tools that we could potentially use in some of the work going forward. So I look forward to that conversation. And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Lorna. I come to the table with so many different paths to this particular role as the ED at Ignite. But I think the two things I just want to highlight. One, I was born in the Philippines. If you've never been, please let me know. My godmother is a travel agent and can help you get your way around town. But it is such a beautiful country, and I immigrated when I was 2.5. And I moved to America really not understanding what politics look like in this country. I grew up with a female president. I grew up understanding that people, when you don't really want the policy or are really happy with it, there's power to the people, like total people power. We have the people power movement, and yellow is one of my favorite colors. And it's probably because I saw a lot of yellow growing up. And that particular path for me was really deeply understanding how different countries can be and how different systems can be across the entire globe, and really taught me as a young person, really thinking about how are we global citizens, and how does the decision I make here in the seat of my lovely office, how does that truly impact humans all across the globe? And so that's one piece I wanted to share. And then the second piece that I wanted to share is I started running for office in the 1st grade. And it was super clear to me sitting in that tiny table in my 1st grade classroom that there were young people that never looked like me. And that's primarily because I went to a school that was like 90% white, but heavily there were boys. And I was like, why aren't girls making the decision about where we're gonna go on our school trip? Because hilariously enough, everyone always wanted to go camping. And if you are Filipino, camping is not like normal. We don't really have camping grounds in the Philippines. And so I was like, why are we choosing camping all the time? And so that particular piece actually really propelled me to continue serving my community. And I continued to sit at these tables where I was like, who are these humans? And why are they making these decisions? And as I continue to keep growing, and now you heard in my bio, I serve as a commissioner for a healthcare board. In January 2017, I was diagnosed with breast cancer the same week that Donald Trump was inaugurated. And it was really thinking about how do we really leverage these different lived experiences, and how do we continue to show up for the work every single day, because the personal is political and the political is personal, and I don't really have that choice to make each day. And so I just wanted to share those two personal stories to really highlight the ways in which I show up to this work and what frames how I make decisions, and really thinking about the global perspective in which and just offer that to folks as a different way of thinking about things. So I am gonna share my screen. Okay, everyone can see it? Okay, thank you, Alicia. You're the only human I can see, so it's like I'm just talking to you today. So we wanted folks to, oh, and then I'll pop the chat box so I can actually read it. Oh, we wanted folks to drop in the chat box 2 kind of reflection questions. The first one is, what are your aha moments from the past 2 days? And then the second question is, what are the barriers that we continue to face in terms of gender justice, anti-racism, and systemic change? So we'll give folks a few, like a minute or 2 to kind of drop in, and you can pick one or both questions. I love that some folks really, really love camping. I'm so happy for you. But please feel free to drop in some of these different answers to these questions. Lorna, what's been your aha moment?
My aha moment has been hearing from folks that have been at this conference for the first time and how affected they have been by some of the speakers, but also just that this is a process already of transformation for some of the, particularly the folks that have come like from Vermont and other regions where, you know, there may not be this much diversity. And so just that authenticity that people are bringing to this, you know, emotions are, you know, people are talking about things like joy and love, and, you know, that's not a typical conference. So I just really appreciate that strength and how we're uplifting and really building solidarity. So yeah, I'm really feeling inspired.
Yeah, it's been really exciting to hear all folks that are like, this is my first conference ever. And I think, you know, we're so audacious in building a conference that actually, you know, up in front and center, it uses the words with deep meaning around anti-racism. I think that is like the most audacious thing that folks can be doing and really putting that front and center right now. I think a lot of folks are tiptoeing around this particular topic, but you know, 'tis the season to really put things front and center. One of my key kind of aha moments from this conference, but also just from this past year, is really hearing from young people and thinking about, we can't unsee any of what is happening in our country right now. I can't close my eyes and pretend that it never happened. And so I think that's something that I'm really walking away with and deeply understanding from folks in the New England area, really thinking about what are you all seeing and what are we all not seeing, and how we're coming to the table with those different perspectives. And I know that we're a little behind time, so please keep dropping in your reflections in the chat box because we'd love to hear them. But I'm going to turn it back over to Lorna to share more about the Institute and also really about this amazing racial equity tool that we want to share with all of you as a framework to think about the solutions that we want to make.
So thank you again, and please do continue putting, you know, your reactions in the chat, and we'll get to that. Maybe we just go to the next slide because I talked a little bit already about how the Institute was formed. Really, what I wanted to share with you today, and this is again really a work in progress, where you know, really inspired by a lot of the work from the local and regional government alliance on race and equity. You know, many folks in the reporting out today, earlier this morning, you know, talked about how we need to redirect like money and funding, or how we need that seat, right, and decision making at the table. And even just again, the inspiration, right, from you know, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley talking about, you know, those, you know, closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And that, another aha moment, you know, so we're really trying to think about then if we're going to go back to our, doing our work to change policies, right? How then can we have anti-racist policies? And so this has been, some long time work, at least in the city of Boston, which has declared, racism a public health issue. We have been using some of these racial equity planning tools in our various, units. And my particular experience has been with the Boston Public Schools in any decision or a policy that is going to be proposed, that there is a rigorous reflection and engagement at every step of the policymaking process to think again with an anti-racist lens and asking, some very, again, like deep questions about what is it to be anti-racist, to support policies, practices, actions that are aimed at dismantling racism and racial hierarchies. So advancing equity, and this is just that framework that I'm sharing here, and I will put like some links in the chat in a minute, where we can think about again at every stage of a law, a policy, or even a practice, a program, where how is it really, advancing equity, both gender equity, and this is about racial equity, but as we're all been, again, talking, and the point of this conference too is those intersectionalities, that we could also be using these kinds of equity planning tools around gender equity as well. I don't see those as, like this is only just about racial equity, because really the idea is that, we're really thinking about, operationalizing goals, establishing protocols for decision-making that are centered on equity, and then offering resources at each of those stages. What we've also heard through the days of our gathering here is, is about budgets and budget crisis, and where do we, where do we value, what do we prioritize, and how do we redirect, right, resources to address the needs. And we have to shift that mindset of a culture of scarcity, right? There is wealth that can be redistributed, right? There are ways that we can, not just be fighting for those crumbs of the pie, but really thinking again, challenging the culture of scarcity. So I wanted to just, if you could go to the next slide real quick, because this is, again, just a way of thinking about how at each stage of analyzing and engaging and organizing for a policy, that we're really thinking critically at each stage, right? Who are the key stakeholders? Again, are there women of color leading in those spaces? Are there young people? Again, all of our other communities, are they engaged internally and externally? How also might there be, unintended consequences of what we might think is an anti-racist policy that might actually further racial equity? And I can think of that very specifically in, say, decisions to close a school, for example, right? That, there's always going to be unintended consequences, but then who gets to make, those kinds of decisions? And then someone else brought that up earlier about the data. I don't know if it was, again, about, it was, just want to recognize who may have mentioned, it was Maria Gonzalez, right? Talked a lot about as well, how we need to disaggregate quantitative data, right? Like COVID, for example, was not being broken down by race and ethnicity initially, the cases. They need to be broken, all the data, right? And we actually have a data equity legislation in Massachusetts. But how do we also use qualitative data, like storytelling, and really getting those voices that may not respond to a poll or a survey, and really, again, thinking about being more inclusive and also having more, say, qualitative data that, again, sort of can advance then our policies. And as well, communication strategies, which has to do a lot with the kind of organizing we're doing, and then the issues around sustainability. So I think that, you know, again, I want to share with you that this is really a multi-stage process where we'll look at each policy. There's a set of questions that we have to really address that have to, again, look at this racial equity lens. And if we're not, you know, addressing those questions, then we don't support that policy. And so I think that, you know, we have to really, you know, maybe think about how as well. And if we could go to the next slide. And again, these are just some questions for our conversation, that we have always been talking about equality, right? You know, like since the civil rights movement. And, you know, I really appreciate sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work on colorblind racism, and that this is the new racisms, that, you know, if we believe in equality, that itself is a form of racism, because what we're excluding, right, those differences in our lived experiences. We're talking more now, right, in terms of this moment in time, you know, about systemic change and equity, but really the goal is liberation. And how do we get to liberation? And so you've seen some of these images that I love from the Interaction Institute for Social Change, and that visual, right, of like, this is really what I think we're aiming for, is for liberation. And so I'm gonna stop there because I know that this is a bigger conversation, but I want you to know that there are many municipalities that are struggling with this, that are trying to bring some of these, you know, frameworks to really bring about systemic change. And I'll throw it back to Sarah.
Thank you. Before we transition to the next part, I'm just curious if anybody has any questions in terms of thinking about these questions and kind of thinking about the framework, and having that as a tool. Charlotte, your face is highlighting for me.
So,
oh, good.
Framework, all of that was discussed. I'm sorry if that is making noise, background noise, but I want to say I concur, support all that was said, and I want to add something. And that picks up on what Lori and Cy Jefferson said when she framed the discussion around all of these issues that impact women. And it can be in a disparate way, in a more sort of profound way, whether we're talking about poverty, sexual abuse, the difficulty in accessing affordable care, health care that's culturally competent, racism, sexism, all these things. And by framing those things, and then also looking to women to advocate for themselves. You know how, if you've ever had anyone who was suffering from an illness, or, so we know, whether it's ourselves or family members, that it is impossible to look to them to advocate for their own health care needs when you're fighting for your life or fighting for your own, your own safety. So I somehow want to just put that out there as something that gets incorporated in our efforts, which is the importance and the hard work of advocating for equality and equity while you are also suffering from inequality and inequitable issues. And that just needs a focus. I think that it doesn't necessarily get the time and attention that probably it's deserving of. Thank you.
Yeah, that's huge. The community board that I sit on, I'm the only one that's ever been through cancer. And I think it's so interesting being on it and being, one, the youngest, but also just the patient, and really thinking through what it means to go through an MRI machine, what it means to go through having, you know, fertility issues in your early 30s, and just how different that really looks, and how that systematically really plays a role within our communities. It really does get exacerbated in a variety of different ways. Thank you. I can't see everyone's name now, the way that my little thing is going on here. But does anybody have any other questions or comments that they would like to add?
I saw in the chat that someone from Vermont is that the state of Vermont is, maybe, can you, what was that? I'm sorry, who said that?
Oh, Carrie said that there's an equity impact assessment tool for the state gov.
Right.
Yeah, there is. This just, it's brand new. And I was just checking online to see if I could find it posted anywhere, and it's not posted anywhere yet. So it may be that it hasn't completely officially launched yet, but I've seen it. And it's a very comprehensive tool that asks many of these questions. When you're making program decisions or budget decisions, it's for state government to use as they're developing something new or as they're figuring out their budget. And it asks a lot of those questions. And I think it's going to be really, really powerful for our operations process, and also for, I'm hoping the legislature will be using this or some version of it as they're analyzing legislation that comes before them, so they can really understand what the true impact will be.
That's amazing. Yeah, I was thinking with the tool to really thinking about, in my role as an executive director, really thinking about how do we take a look at this for each of our programmatic layers. And 'tis the season, we are constantly shifting because of the way that COVID is leading us. So really thinking about how can we leverage this tool, and really thinking about our young people as we make each of these different decisions, and then just the variety of the different young people that we have all across the country. Does Anita Bruno want to share? Okay, maybe I misread that. Okay, I will keep going. So
Uh-oh, is Sarah frozen? Sarah, I think your video's frozen. Can you hear us? Okay. Well, Sarah was going to share some more slides for the next piece. But let's see if she will be able to rejoin us here. Oh, what's happening? Okay. Well, I did have a question about, you know, even that image there that I'm showing you, you know, it's like, it's a male image, right? It's all boys. And so how do we even like critique some of these frameworks that are coming out, right, for state governments or municipal governments that also have that intersectional lens? And, you know, like what's missing, right? What sort of questions are missing there that we should be holding, you know, our leaders accountable? I think there's a lot of tokenism, and I know that was mentioned earlier today as well, when right now, if you know, everybody's like sort of jumping on the racial equity bandwagon. I hate to put it that way, but you know, like funders now have shifted, you know, their directions to try to be more, you know, attentive to racial justice. But it can be also for many of us, right? It feels like, well, you know, it took you why did it take so long? You know, it took a pandemic to get people to pay attention when we know there's been police brutality for decades, hundreds, centuries. So how do we, you know, get to really we can have these tools, but the critique has been, well, then you're just like checking off the box. Like, okay, well, we had stakeholder engagement. We had, you know, X number from this group that were part of this process. So I just curious what other folks think about that of, and then one more thing, that, and then this idea, right, again, that I find very powerful of those, again, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And certainly Sarah sharing from her experience, you know, being a cancer survivor and in those spaces, but still being the only one, right? So how do we, again, you know, bring, you know, have more inclusivity, but not tokenize either, and not expect then that it should be the people most affected by those problems that are also, you know, supposed to be solving them, like racism, for example, right? You know, who should be, right, working towards you know, racial justice at this moment? Those are still complicated, you know, conversations that we're having. I'm curious what people think about, again, trying to engage with voices that aren't there, or cannot maybe be there, like what Charlotte was saying, you know, what, how can we advocate, how do we do advocacy for those who maybe are not able to advocate for themselves, and then not also tokenize people.
So I didn't say Lorna. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, sorry, I made it back, but I'll let someone answer that question and then I will finish up. Sorry, everyone.
I was just going to say that I just want to say that people can be compensated. That's all for the advocacy. We are looked to, people are looked to for their free advice and their free work around advocacy. And maybe there needs to be a number around, you know, there's something around compensation in that way. I just throw that out.
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm sorry. Can I go?
I have a comment. I'm wondering, because I had that experience being the only person of color in my doctorate program, if jumping on the bandwagon and everybody, you know, now, oh, we need to, you know, work on racial equality, is jumping on the bandwagon because of that and what's happening with the movement right now is enhancing tokenism, because then other people will look at you if you are hired in a majority white, you know, organization, or if you are maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 of a student in a majority white school, you know, how then will others view you? Oh, you're only here because, you know, right now we're on this, you know, we're trying to, you know, bring equality and we're trying to work with systematic racism. But then how do you change the minds of those who view you as being that token? Oh, you're just here to check off that box. Because a lot of times that is how I felt in my doctoral program, is that, oh, you're just the affirmative action token woman of color, and you're only here because of that, and discounting that it was my intellect and my skills, and, you know, I had to do everything everybody else had to do to get into the program, and I had to do everything everybody else had to do to get out of the program, to graduate. So I'm just wondering if that may backfire in some way, because you can't change society's views all in one swoop as it centers around racism. So, you know, will that backfire? That's one of my concerns.
Hi.
Okay.
All right, I think I'm gonna jump back in. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Oh, the internet issues of the world. I am on my phone now and you get to see my face really up close. Sorry, everybody. I think that is a huge piece of the conversation too. And I know that we're gonna have to transition into the breakout pieces. So I think I'm gonna just finish up this Ignite piece, and I'm sorry I can't see everything in the chat box because I'm on my phone.
I wonder, I'm sorry, Sarah, but there is someone that has been wanting to speak. At least can we give a minute to Pam Davis, perhaps? And then I don't know how we are doing on time, sorry.
We do have 3 hands up right now, but we are quite over time.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if maybe we would want to take these comments as, first comments once we go into the breakout rooms. But I will let you, Lorna and Sarah, make the call on that.
Okay, no, sounds good. Sarah?
Okay, I'll just finish. I know I can't share my slides, but I'll just finish them quickly. And then I will let you all go from there. So I think you heard me at the end talk about the framework of thinking about Ignite and really thinking about a cultural shift within what's happening within our young women across the country right now. And a couple things I just wanted to highlight that we've been really seeing and have been talking about, I think, at various levels within the conference is really this piece of we just can't unsee what we're currently seeing in this country and really mobilizing around these different pieces. And one of the key things that we talked about in our breakout sessions too was that we can't do policy change without organizing within this particular movement, and that each piece can really play a part in that. I think we all know how underrepresented women are across the country in Congress with under 25%. The state ledge has increased a little bit, closer to 30%, but we're still fairly low with our governorship and our mayors even within this election. And the work that we're doing at Ignite is really focused in on the most local levels, really thinking about the mayor to the mosquito abatement board, and thinking about as the federal government is really trying to work hard around some very federal pieces, a lot of these local policies are getting made. And so, for example, we have a young woman who is in Texas at Dallas ISD, and she is working really hard with trying to figure out if students should go back to school or not. And so having a perspective of a 23-year-old who is a student of DISD is a really huge piece in thinking about that. And so I think, however, we started this conversation with really thinking about each of us are coming to the table with quite a variety of different experiences, quite a variety of different perspectives, but really thinking about how do we each come to the table and participate in all of the different ways that we can. And so I think most of you know this by now, but really Ignite is a movement of young women who are ready and eager to become the next generation of political leaders. We're the largest young women's political org in the country and the only organization that provides sustained political leadership. And I truly believe that our young women really represent the diversity of this country and truly are meeting the moment for what's happening in this country right now. And so I think the 2 things that Lorna and I wanted to leave you with were 2 big questions that I think have really been starting to highlight as I was reconnecting, but really thinking about how can these tools and these frameworks and this different thinking really support us moving forward, and how can we really think about a multi-generational approach to this work. And so I think, Lorna, do you have anything else to add?
No, that's great. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay. Carrie, I'll throw it back to you. I can't see, I see flashings of the comments, but I can't access them on my phone. So I'm going to throw it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lorna and Sarah. That was a great way to kind of set the stage for our state-based breakouts that are coming up next. I want to ask everyone, if you haven't yet renamed yourself with your state at the beginning of your name, please do that now. That will help us to make sure you go to the right place. We will have a very, very short break while everyone's getting sent off to where they need to go. And excuse me, in these discussions, we'll be asking you to think about 3 questions. And I'll read them aloud to you, and then we'll also have them in the breakouts. So what are the key challenges and opportunities for marginalized women in your state, including for young people and those from communities of color? Of these challenges and opportunities, what do you see as the priority issues? What criteria did you use to determine that these were your priority issues? And lastly, what are your organizations or you as individuals or your communities doing to address these challenges and opportunities? And what additional strategies need to be employed to address them? We're hoping you'll be able to learn from each other, come up with some solutions together, think about some actions that you all can take and make connections that you'll be able to use after this conference is over. Okay, so I will let you all get sent off to your rooms now, and we'll see you back here in about 45 minutes. A little bit of time now to hear some summaries of what happened in your discussion, some report outs, and we're going to go one by one, and I'll just call on you, and then you can give us, how much time do we have for this? We have we have like maybe like 5 minutes for each one, 5 to 10 minutes for each. 5 minutes? And we'll start with Connecticut, Maine, and New Hampshire. And Monica Borgatti is going to summarize for us.
Hi, folks. I'm Monica Borgatti. I work with the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts. And as a steering committee member, I offer to be helpful in a group that is states that I'm not of. So I can't wait to hear the Massachusetts recordings, but happy to share. We had representation from Connecticut and Maine. And so I'm going to try to not speak too quickly so that our interpreters can follow, but I want to get you as much of this as I can. In Connecticut, the state is very disparate when it comes to racial and gender equity. And so we're talking about a lot about bridging the divide between the predominantly white suburbs and then the urban centers that are mostly BIPOC. And in terms of funding, so it's a barrier for students as well as teachers, and that I guess they have a lot of some of the lowest recruitment efforts for teachers of color. There's a huge gap in this area. And for such a small state, regionalism is seen as a really big issue, and it feels very segregated. There was more talk about lack of resources in the education system, and one of our group members shared that her son became a teacher, I believe a high school teacher, and he received a lot of resistance and racism from the older teachers and staff at the school, and this caused him to leave the job. He decided not to be a teacher anymore, which was really damaging for him and really for the children, because those students of color saw themselves in him. He was somebody that they could relate to. And so this, not just a problem for that teacher, but really for those kids who aren't getting what they need out of their teachers. The older teachers who were there longer didn't appreciate his style and didn't accept him. So that's really unfortunate. In Maine, a lot of the issues that the representative from Maine saw were more around issues of sexual, physical, emotional violence in schools and how it was being covered up. And he spoke a little bit about how a lot of voices were marginalized there, but he saw it as an opportunity to help empower women and those of color who wanted to be a part of the solution. Looking on to the second question about the challenges and opportunities and what the folks from Connecticut and Maine thought were the priority issues. Connecticut, they talked about the lack of jobs to keep young people in the state. So brain drain was a big topic of conversation here, as well as worker retraining programs. We also talked a little bit about living wage jobs and how minimum wage being raised there is an important factor. Just skimming through my notes here, there was some conversation about older generations working in some of the factory jobs there. They've been in the same jobs 35 or 40 years, but want to retire due to lack of training that's available as factory jobs become obsolete and as more things move to automation. We also talked a little bit about how how we push college so hard, but it really isn't for everyone, and that we should be looking at the trades as a viable option. There was some discussion around looking at education cost sharing formula and how funds are distributed. This is an issue for both of the states that were represented, Connecticut and Maine. And then we talked very briefly about police accountability in Connecticut. The last question, what are your organizations doing to address the challenges and opportunities? In Connecticut, there's a survey about how COVID has affected women, and they're hoping to collect qualitative and quantitative data to use for promoting legislative strategies to help women who are being forced out of the workforce. And then we also talked a little bit about legislation around domestic violence issues. There was some discussion around working with the Office of Early Education on 2-gen policies and how poverty doesn't exist in a silo. So they're working to bring together 20 different agencies, including the Department of Labor and Department of Health and DSS and DPH, to help them work together more efficiently, looking at, well, when you're offering job training sessions, are you also thinking about transportation, and are you thinking about childcare for the participants? There's also discussion around benefits cliff with that. And from Maine, we heard that a strategy would be really trying to get more young people involved in what's happening and getting them more in touch with and in front of the legislators. So I think that is a decent summary of what we talked about. If I missed anything, please feel free to share it in the chat in case I've talked too long. I'm not sure. Thank you.
That was a perfect amount of time, actually, Monica, and you made me realize that I was a little vague about the timing before, but I have since done the math, and 5 minutes is what you each have, and if we stick to that, we'll be good. So next we will go to, there were 2 Massachusetts groups, and the first one we'll hear from Sasha Goodfriend.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Nicole for taking such great notes during our breakout group. I will be referring to them right now. So the first thing we talked about in terms of problems was actually not in terms of the issue areas necessarily, like we have been discussing throughout this conference, but was about the issue of working in silos. And we talked about working in silos, both in terms of organizations like schools and prisons and jails being organized on a hyper-local level, as we're in a Republican administration, and how much of a challenge that is for consistency in policy, but also with our own organizations. We really resented feeling like we were competing for funding and feeling like we needed to be the best at something when we know that we share a lot of the same challenges as our peer organizations and want to be able to be rewarded for collaborating. And I think one of the benefits of our group was that we had people from all different sectors, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. And we had some funders speak to their own benefit of collaboration and encouraging folks to talk about collaboration in their funding appeals. And so also a knock against capitalism and the nonprofit industrial complex for stifling our work in those ways. The revolution will not be funded was a term that Lorna reminded us of as well. This led us into a conversation around the challenges for organizations at encouraging youth leadership and not wanting to be tokenizing in our encouragement of youth leadership. And so we talked about not just, we need to offer compensation to bring folks at the table to have their input, but also we can't think about engagement as a one-off opportunity. We need to think about sustained plans for reaching back out to folks, even if their life is not stable enough to be able to commit to regular meetings and consistent meetings. As the organizations, we want to be consistent in our reaching out to young people and continuing to bring them back to the table, and to lead the conversations and to recognize that it does take more work and money to be doing this work, and yet it's 100% necessary in the way we want to be working. This led us into a conversation around training as something that is being asked for more which is good, but also is not the end all, because one training is not a checkbox for someone. We're doing re-education that was not taught in schools, which we talked a lot about. And so needing to have more state funding and funding in general for comprehensive trainings that happen annually, so that there's a training philosophy, if you will, for all organizations. Also, I want to give a shout out to Shatia talking a lot about relationship building as being real work. So again, not wanting to be only transactional, but really needing to care about the personal in our political work. And in terms of some work that folks are doing on the ground, and then also as a problem, we talked about leadership development and wanting to train people to be organizers more. So work on the ground, you should know about Mass Now's menstrual equity bill, the IAM bill to have menstrual products be free in schools, prisons, and shelters. Not a new issue, but the first time Massachusetts is talking about periods ever. We talked about the Healthy Youth Bill, 10 years, still trying to get comprehensive, medically accurate sex education passed. This is necessary not just for health, but for consent, as we talk about healthy relationships. We talked about state funding for DV shelters across the state, because they're doing incredible work and they're getting more cases than ever before. And so we need more funding for that direct service work that's happening. We talked about Trans Day of Remembrance, which was last week, which was created in honor of Rita Hester, a trans woman of color who was murdered in Alston in the 90s and is now commemorated all over the world, in intersectionality in that case. And we were really excited about the civics legislation that Generation Citizens students spearheaded passing in 2018. And we talked about how we could collaborate with students and schools in our region to take advantage of that curriculum mandate and use that as a pipeline for getting involved in our work. And quick update on the Roh Act. If you don't know, now you know. There's a version that was passed in an amendment in the state budget that is going to the governor's desk. And so that coalition has been doing incredible work that a lot of us are a part of, and make sure that it passes through the governor's desk by calling him. And last thing I'll just say is a line from Elizabeth Warren when she was at this conference in 2016, when they go low, we go local. So we just wanted to share that with you all as a reminder for why we do this work here on the state and local level. So thank you all.
Thank you, Sasha. That was very comprehensive. Our second Massachusetts group will hear from Maria Rogers.
Yes, hi, thank you, everyone. My name is Maria Rogers. I'm in the GLPP program. And as everyone was talking, I was skimming through my notes to see what were the emerging themes that we gravitated to in our session. And a lot of our conversations centered around education and K-12 education and higher education pipeline. So we talked about the importance of passing a Black curriculum. And I believe there's a young woman that was in our group who said she has been on the forefront of that. And how do we reframe our history and our conversation? Because there is a feeling that if we have more Black curriculum starting in 8th grade, that we can highlight more BIOP history and therefore build self-esteem. So how do we recruit more people of color that looks like us? How do we begin to move forward and in working with corporations in the pipeline stemming around the STEM looking at STEM and recruitment. And someone made a comment that there's a lot of organizations that say that there are not women of color who have the qualifications, and that it's the corporations that are the issues and the gatekeepers. And so therefore we don't have a lot of young people, young girls who want to enter those, the STEM programs, because there's just not a recruitment for them. We looked at how do we engage more of the community as far as having a voice in the curriculum for those schools that are predominantly white. And Akia made a huge contribution in that, where she said, working with the school boards and engaging the parents in having a voice in their children's curriculum, especially in predominantly white schools, so that we can uplift them and help bridge the gap in that pipeline. We also talked about how our stories are important, that we need our stories, our shared stories of all women of color to stand in our power, because it is those shared stories that also bridge gaps. And it was just so much. How do we recruit and hire educators of color in predominantly white schools? And I don't think there was really an answer to that. But I would like to add that I don't think that there is not an issue with women of color wanting to enter those institutions. It is the institution's problem. It is one young lady commented that racism is a white person's problem. And we have to first, white people have to first get engaged with that, why that is an issue, and what is their role in not recruiting people of color in those spaces. So unless white people acknowledge that racism is an issue, that it is a problem with them, and therefore it filters out into the rest of the community as to why there are not people that look like us, who are teachers and educators, or who are scientists going into organizations, that first has to be addressed. Lori said something about we need to flip the script. So while we are always having the conversation as to why it is a problem for us, we're always discussing that Black people are always saying, people of color are always saying, you know, we see this is a problem, we say that is a problem, but we need to flip the script and say, no, it is the organizations that are the problem. It's the institutions that are the problem. It is that bridge, that is why we don't have a pipeline into higher education. So rather than putting it on ourselves, we need to start pushing back, use our voice, our power, our stories to literally engage corporations and say, hey, you're the problem. And so stand in our power by engaging them more to help develop policy in pushing back as to why there's an issue in education. So to sum it up, there was discussion around we need more Black history, we need more multicultural education. So it's not just about, you know, Black history, it's about, you know, Asian American history, Hispanic history. I mean, everyone needs to be represented in the school system. Overall, we need more recruitment of people of color. We need to encourage more girls to go into STEMs. We need to engage the community, the voices of the Black parents, to have more of a say. We can reach back into those communities as well to find talent. We also talked about how there are mothers who are out of work, who also can be a voice in that, and how we can pull them back into the workforce because they also have the soft skills, the technical skills, the education, and the intelligence to put them back into the workforce. And that's pretty much Did I cover it all, or did I miss anything?
I'm just gonna make two very quick points because I know that we have to move for time. I think the other thing that was brought up by Phyllis Smith from the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women is that we have to think about the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in terms of unemployment, people being forced out of their professions, and how that relates to intersectionality. I think the other thing that was brought up is that the middle class is also suffering as well. We have high wage workers, tech workers who have lost their jobs, and that they're also problematic in terms of addressing their needs as well. So I wanted to bring those 2 points up.
Thank you so much. So much happened in Massachusetts. Next up, we have Rhode Island. Kelly Nevins is going to share with us.
Hi, everyone. I just want to recognize that we had fully a third of elected officials in our room today. So that was a real opportunity to talk about some of the very real issues that these folks are seeing. I'll start briefly by saying, that we touched on some of the things with regards to the pandemic that just make life in general so much more difficult, such as child and family care issues, which is challenging when you already have a job, but is so much worse if you're somebody who's looking for a job and you have these things that are making a deeper hole to climb out of. Also economic instability. So many of us have had job changes this year, but particularly for young women and women of color who don't have much of a financial cushion, it's been a really, really challenging and scary year. In fact, Rep. Liana Kazar coined the phrase for me, dancing around zero in our bank accounts. And I think that's really important. But honestly, a huge amount of our discussion today really focused around the lack of support for women of color in our state, just generally, and also for our elected officials. So one person was talking about how people of color really have to leave the state in order to get ahead, or even just to hear about their heritage. And while there's appreciation for the fact that organizations and institutions are making statements around anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion, really it's a smokescreen that they're not doing much to implement changes or do things that would actually make a better life for people of color within the state. And the recognition that bringing white women to the table is fine, but it's not a definition of diversity, that we need to bring our sisters of color up as well. So as we were talking about challenges and opportunities, it was noted that we really need to change the legislative process. And a lot is happening right now behind closed doors with limited community input. In Rhode Island, a lot of our, we haven't had the legislative General Assembly really meet much during the pandemic. And so there hasn't been an opportunity to engage a lot of community voices. On the other hand, certainly many women have become activists. Many people of color have become activists in the last 4 years, in the last year. And we have just seen power shifts within our General Assembly. We'll have a new House leader. We have some great new committee chairs who have been elected and moved into place. The major concern here is really that there's still people who are working on sort of their own issues. I will say, just so people can understand where this was going, really sort of being siloed and focused on their own thing. And there was a concern shared that people in power may ask our legislators to limit their support of some things, sort of holding the carrot of getting your own piece of legislation passed, as long as you don't help to move along these things that would help a broader swath of the community. And so there was a request to really lift up our sisters in power and the things that they were working on, and instead of just being solely focused on your own thing, to move it forward. And there was a note to get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, which I think is really important. So in terms of, sort of policies that this group lifted up, it was, although the discussion was less on policies and more on legislative change, we did talk about childcare, climate justice, wage equity, education, living wages, access to healthcare, and the removal of SROs in schools. But really, the majority of the conversation was around how community building is critical, and we can use this virtual climate now as an opportunity to bring more voices to the table. And to that end, there was a request to keep the conversation going with the Rhode Island participants. So, we can create perhaps an ongoing listserv or some discussion with the folks from Rhode Island and say, how do we keep these issues at the forefront and keep moving them forward? And if I have missed anything, I would love it if my folks would put stuff in the chat. But I hope that I represented our conversation appropriately.
And our last report out comes from Esther Rogers in the Vermont group.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. I was making sure my notes were concise. I want to thank everyone who joined us in the Vermont group. So the main takeaways from this was basically that Vermont is predominantly a white population, and there's lack of access to information regarding women who want to run for office. And also to that, the information is largely unknown, and that we need to be able to champion the visibility and around issues and getting the message out around policy issues that have an impact on women in general, but also to incorporate people of color's voices also into that conversation. There's also a lack of absence of acknowledging that racism is actually real in certain states, whereas there's predominantly white, and we need to be able to educate people on the fact that racism is real, and that we need to actually stop gaslighting issues in people's lived experiences also too. And we need to speak to power and try to uplift their voices also too, because they are experts on their lives and how that impact has affected them also too. Another thing was like, was really coming out, and people can jump in the chat if I'm not really being articulate in the my summary is that being, African-American women, they have challenges when they run for office, where they're being disparaged on social media and also in the public, whereas that it makes some women not want to run for public office only because of the pushback they get from various sectors in our community. And also too, was brought out is that there's so many different areas out there that need to be addressed, so many issues that need to be addressed. But then it's like, I suggested that, like my grandmother said to me years ago, was to make sure, how do you eat an elephant? It's always, one piece at a time, because of the fact that, you get you'll get tired, lose our energy, be disengaged from the conversation. And unfortunately, people of color do not have the privilege to be disengaging from the conversation, because we are living through that ourselves on a regular basis. Another thing was, the acknowledgement of people causing racial harm. That was a point, enlightening comment, whereas that we go through lives interconnecting with other different communities, and we're not realizing that we are actually causing racial harm, and that we need to be able to identify that and try to work, unpack that also too. Another thing that came up that, in the conversation was about internalized racism. And whereas there is various levels of consensus among women of color when it comes down to supporting or not supporting certain legislation or policies, and trying to figure out, how do we navigate that space also too. And I believe my takeaway from that is we need to understand that the Black and Brown community, AAPI, Native Indigenous communities, and LGBTQAI plus communities are not monolithic, and we need to understand that. We have various different issues that we want to go ahead and put forth, but then as also too, we need to understand that as you are actually working on yourselves and doing self-reflection on your complicity and your bias, these communities are also working on unpacking their generational trauma and on their psyche and on their bodies as well. And they're learning to decolonize the language as well as destroying the tools of the oppressor that we have been socialized to endure. So those are the things that I believe that was the main takeaway. What I would like to add is another terminology, right, to the lexicon, right, about cultural humility. Cultural humility is a step away from cultural competencies. And the overall goal of practicing cultural humility is to be aware of one's own values and beliefs. And if a person cannot begin to understand the makeup and context of another person's life without being aware and reflective of their own background and situation first, that I believe is really something that we really need to take away with that also too, because we as people who are engaging with different cultural identities, we need to give them space, hold space for them to articulate their experience inclusive of culture. And we are supposed to be the learners of that experience. We honor people's perspectives as truth, even when they are different from ours. And we have to have a willingness to suspend what we know or what we think we know about a person based upon the generalizations that we have come to accept as the norm. We also need to understand the learning comes from what we learn about their person's culture, stemming from being open to what they themselves have determined is their personal expression of their heritage and culture. So that in a nutshell is about understanding and moving away from cultural competency into a cultural humility, where we're allowing people to define what their culture means to them and not based on stereotypes and generalizations that we had, incorporated into our psyche and our language. So like I said, thank you everyone for being open and transparent. And if I missed anything, please forgive, charge it to my head and not my heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther. I really appreciated that summary. And thanks to all of you who shared out. And I am going to hand the baton back over to Dr. Lori and Saya Jefferson for our final closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Hasn't this been a thoughtful and wonderful conference? I think we did more than our due diligence. We have garnered new information, made incredible connections, have been reactivated for the work ahead, particularly as it relates to doing our work, utilizing an anti-racist and gender justice lens. We should ask ourselves, where do we draw from? Where is my deep well that nourishes not just my ideas, but my soul? What brings me passion? What brings me peace? What strengthens me? Often when I think about these issues, I think about being a womanist. What does that mean? This is something I talk about all the time. Translated, this concept of a womanness refers to being an African-American woman who is audacious, outrageous, in charge, and responsible. Regardless of your race and your age, we are all womanists. In hope and transformation, a womanness engenders mutuality and community amidst responsibility and stewardship of freedom, and honors the image of God, or alternatively, the essential goodness in all of us. Being a womanist invites one to live in the present while simultaneously being a student of history, engaging in radical discerning, listening, seeing, knowing, challenging, analyzing, and making a difference. Being a womanist is a way of thinking and living that takes seriously the exposure, analysis, and transformation of societal and personal injustices and oppressions that affect those who usually matter least in society. A womanist utilizes an intersectional, interdisciplinary lens and values the knowledge of everyday people who create the narratives for their needs that you may represent through your policymaking, policy analysis, or nonprofit work, or even in your home or with your friends. If a womanist is audacious and courageous, then a womanist is to not only engage in the easy dialogues, but also, most especially, to engage in the difficult ones. It means raising issues that maybe our mamas would not dare to raise or even knew how to raise. We are obligated to move beyond the places of our displacement to the places of our discomfort, and thus to enlist the difficult dialogues. To reiterate, we are to name the unjust privileges that even we may unwittingly are complicit with. Furthermore, womanist moral agency requires what Katie Cannon identifies, that boldness to expose the sin of our comfort zones and others' actions. Kelly Brown, a womanist scholar, further notes that as a womanist, you must steadfastly affirm yours and others' authentic knowledge. Is the knowledge you put forth from those that you are stewards for intimately connected to life-sustaining and liberatory activity? Does it contribute to the survival and wholeness of entire peoples, particularly people of color and women of color? Authentic knowledge is not which fosters any form of oppressive power. On the contrary, it is that challenges, it's the knowledge that challenges dominating power, including the complex discourses that help individuals to maintain their power. Michael Foucault reminds us that power, especially inequitable power, projects a will to knowledge. In other words, power enlists the intellectual community to provide the unnecessary knowledge base to legitimate and sustain it. So, what we need to say is that we must remember that each of us is a leader, a divine original. We are created to make unique contributions in life, one that only we can make. This is true for you, and this is true for me. That said, turn any obstacles in your path to dust. Once you focus on and believe in your own attributes, you have the power to succeed. You have the power to move this society forward. You have the power to win. So release the known and embrace your power in the lives of your communities and the lives for those that care about you. Go out and make a difference. What I also want to say today is to really, really thank all of you who attended. It was very, very powerful to hear your voices, to hear your recommendations and your suggestions. I also want to thank all of the sponsors who supported our event over the last few days. We are very, very thankful for your contributions. So I would ask all of us to have a wonderful day, and we will continue to do the hard work that we all have been doing for so long. So thank you.